Yeah, as Zoe said, I'm the Volunteer and Communications Officer on the Scottish Invasive Species Initiative. You heard from my colleague Callum this morning about the mink side of our project, and I'm specifically talking about engaging communities and volunteers with invasive species control. So hopefully a little bit of something for everybody in here, because it's something we all think about or possibly do already. In terms of our project, we do cover a very large area, about a third of Scotland. And although we're a big project, we are doing that at a very, very local level. In that we have numerous partners, which are the fishery trust fishery trusts right across the area. We've got 10 partners there, and we've got our own project staff. So when volunteers are working with us, they have a local contact, someone based in their community, that is their go-to person. The aim of the project is very much looking at the long-term problem of invasive species. Rob mentioned it right at the beginning, that invasive species are a long-term problem. Our project's just 4 years long, possibly 5 years if we get an extension. So we're looking very much at setting up a sustainable community-based way of treating invasive species. When our project is finished, will the locals, will the community, will the volunteers carry on after we've gone and do that management of species? We'll wait and see. So as a quick introduction, what do our volunteers do with us on the SISI project? One of the biggest volunteering activities is Himalayan balsam pulling. It's very inclusive, anyone can do it, anyone can get involved, individuals, groups, schools, you name it, everybody loves it. We do a lot of plant control work by pesticide application. That's mainly backpack sprayers, treatment for giant hogweed predominantly, and we also in the autumn do stem injection of Japanese knotweed. We do some bits of plant control that are non-chemical. So if we've got hogweed later in the year and it's flowering, we do a lot of cutting off of flowering heads. We've tried a little bit of digging, mainly as an activity volunteers can get involved in rather than if they don't want to get involved in chemical use, and a few kind of overwinter activities like cutting back knotweed stems so we can access areas the next year. Plant survey, there we go, we've just mentioned drones. Some of our volunteers help do plant surveys along the rivers. We tend to do it instinctively from the riverbanks, but quite often it's easier to do it from the river itself. We've engaged with a few kayak and canoe clubs, or we have done some work with drone surveys along some areas of the river as well, like Simon was just talking about. The mink monitoring, again, we've got a huge number of volunteers involved in mink monitoring. Monitoring, we've got 2 stages to this, which Callum referred to earlier. Monitoring a raft. And I have to give a big shout out to Amelia, who's on the left-hand side of the screen there, because I saw her name pop up in the chat feed earlier. And I suspect Amelia is the youngest person attending this conference today. So hello, Amelia. Volunteers can monitor a mink raft. It's quite an easy task to do. You only need to visit your raft once a week, once every 2 weeks, and check it for footprints. If we get mink footprints on a raft, we then turn it into trapping mode and put a trap on. And quite often we find at this point, we do lose some volunteers. Not lose them completely, but they don't want to take that step to get involved in mink trapping. For some of them, it's just a step too far, and for some of them, it's a time issue. We've got some volunteers, sent a picture there, the hay reed beds down in Perth, and we've got a great little group of volunteers down there who couldn't themselves individually take on monitoring a trap because that involves going to see it every single day. That's a legal requirement. You check it every 24 hours. They've made a cooperative. There's 2 or 3, I think it's 3 or 4 of them in their little group, and they take it in turns to check the trap. They've got a very good communication system and they're in contact daily. The other way we deal with losing volunteers when it comes to trapping is we just take the traps back in hand. So if we've got to the stage with a mink monitoring raft that it needs a trap on, that can revert back to our project officers to take on the monitoring of the trap. Or we use this bit of technology here on the right hand side, which is a mink police unit. And that's an automatic trap detection unit. So when the trap is triggered, this little magnet here gets pulled off the main unit, and that automatically sends a signal instantly to your mobile phone to tell you that your trap's been triggered. We've got quite a lot of volunteers involved in our project. We started the project in spring of 2018. Mink volunteers, they're in orange, plant ones in green. There's some overlap, and people do both. But yeah, significant numbers, a couple of hundred to start with on the mink, which built up to 350. Obviously, 2020, our numbers dropped off with inevitably with COVID, people not being able to volunteer, but we hope to build that back up strongly this year. So how do we recruit these volunteers? This is the question everybody always wants to know. How do we persuade someone to put on one of these extremely nice chemical suits, a pair of plastic waders, and wander around carrying 15 kilos of heavy pesticide on their back and go and tackling these 15-foot high plants, or go out every single day, whatever the weather, getting soaking wet to check a mink trap? Well, we start at the beginning. We've put a lot of effort and a lot of work into engaging people. That can be the communities. We do have obviously a strategy of where we're treating. We work along rivers, and we work from the top of the river downstream. So sometimes we can identify specific communities, little villages that are actually on that river at the point where we want to treat plants. So we can target geographically various communities. Sometimes it's user groups. We target angling associations, fishermen, people who use the river. And sometimes it's just the wider general public. We'll have help from anybody and anybody. And the other main user group we target quite heavily is land managers, because obviously a land manager who owns the land on the side of the river is a perfect partner for us to get involved in the project. And what we're doing when we're engaging with all these communities, oh heck, just got a big scribble on my screen. That's rather interesting. Don't know if everybody else is seeing that. I don't have an eraser, so that wasn't me. Anyway, I'll carry on regardless and ignore that big scribble. Is we're raising awareness and understanding. So we're trying to do what was mentioned at the beginning. We're trying to change hearts and minds. We're trying to get people to understand about invasive species. We'll introduce the invasive species, in this case an American mink. We'll talk about its impacts, help people understand why it's such a problem, specifically in this case of water voles. And then the solution is very much how you can help, how you can get involved and you can make a difference and how you can help. And we quite often find when we've done that, people are much keener to get involved. As Rob said at the beginning, he used the same word, it's a very emotive issue, invasive species, and it's not something everybody agrees with or wants to get involved with. We have people who are growing Himalayan balsam in their gardens and don't want to take it out of their gardens. They like it. Not a lot you can do about that. As a project, we do use a lot of pesticide. We use glyphosate. We use it safely and the minimum amounts possible. But again, not everyone wants to get involved in applying pesticides and herbicides. And of course, mink, it's a cute, fluffy animal in some people's opinion, and not everyone wants to get involved in it or agree with what we do there. Alan mentioned that earlier, we've had very little negative response in removing mink, which I think we're quite lucky about. So how do we do all this engagement with communities? Nothing new here. You'll all recognise all these things. We do an awful lot of talks. We chat to community groups. We do presentations. It's now webinars. In the days when we could, we did events and guided walks. We set up our stall in fields, at shows, game fairs, la-di-da, talk to people. We're not a huge fan of the printed material. We have one little leaflet there, which is pocket size, smaller than a mobile phone, just a handy little guide with some facts about species and some hints about biosecurity, what you can do to help and how you can volunteer. We've got one project, we've got one poster which we've tried using in a few areas through mink volunteers. But again, our messaging is quite clear. It's not come and help us kill mink, it's come and help us save wildlife. We do have quite strong online presence. We have a project website. I really should have put the web address up there, but it's invasivespecies.scot. We haven't reinvented the wheel. We direct people a lot to the GBNNS website, the Secretariat website for ID information. The website is mainly about what we do and how people can get involved and how they can help. We've also got a blog post running. We get quite a lot of hits on the blog post. I think that one there, the ins and sprouts of giant hogweed control, is still the most read blog yet, which Karen, one of our project officers, wrote about all the wild and wacky ideas that have ever been tried for giant hogweed. And we have social media presence, which we do quite a bit of. Publications and press, we work hard to get our message out there. We write in local magazines, national magazines, things in the papers, and various news bits and pieces as well. So all these things are very good at raising the awareness of invasive species, and they're good at changing hearts and minds and getting people on board. But the question is, which of these actually generate volunteers and get people involved? And when our volunteers join our project, we ask them to fill in a registration form, and we do have that question on there of, how did you hear about us? So top of the list is by our staff and partners. So word of mouth, chatting to our project officers, chatting to Fishery Trust staff, that's absolutely top, one-on-one. The work and university column here is quite big because we include our definition of volunteering quite widely. So we've got Scottish Wildlife Trust people, we've got staff at RSPB who look after mink rafts as part of their job. So they're in this category here as work, and that's why that one's quite high. After that, social media, website or blog, quite significant number of people find us online and get in touch online through Facebook asking to volunteer. Then all those activities we've done, talking to clubs and organisations, again back to personal recommendations from a friend, and getting a bit less popular. People do see us on the paper and press, and that does generate some volunteers and other volunteering activities. Less so the posters, the newsletters, and right at the bottom, sit events and shows. So the activities where we're very much in a community talking about what people can we had community payback team there, gillies who work on the river, people who've got problem plants in their backyard. And we've also got a few animals here we count as our volunteers. And strange to one of our seasonal project officers who was with us last year, Morella. And Morella is a dog trainer in the previous life. So she trained Bonnie as a mink detection dog to try and help her sniff out exactly where mink were, so she knew where to put her mink traps. And she had some quite good early success with Bonnie. We also have a flock of sheep on our list of volunteers, and we're running a trial there, again looking at non-chemical ways of hogweed control, with the aim of coming up with some guidance for land managers around grazing regimes, and when you need to put sheep on, how long you need them on, how many, to be successful with hogweed grazing. If you want a few facts and figures, 2/3 of our volunteers are male, not quite sure why, a third female, and about 60% are employed, so full-time, part-time or self-employed, and nearly a quarter retired, and then a few other odds and ends. But it's kind of irrelevant about who they are and what they do, doesn't really matter, one volunteer to another, but the factor they all share in common is their motivation. When we ask the volunteers, what do you hope to gain from volunteering? Right at the beginning here, 95% of our volunteers responded they're doing it to conserve the countryside. So that message, again, we've talked about, it's not a negative thing removing invasive species, it's a positive conservation message, and that's why people are doing it, and I think people are recognising that now. It's becoming a slightly larger factor, I think, with the green recovery, more people connecting with nature, wanting to give something back, so I think we're going to see an increase in volunteering. Volunteering doesn't just happen by magic. Anybody who's been involved in managing volunteers will know it takes some management work. When we're doing plant treatment, we supervise pesticide use one-on-one. So you do often think by the time you've done your introduction to the volunteers, you've gone through the risk assessments, you've explained equipment, you could have actually just done it yourself in half the time. So you do sometimes question to yourself, what's the point of all the volunteer work? Even on the mink project, where volunteers are working independently, the phone's constantly off the hook, oh, my raft washed away in the high rivers, or my tunnel washed off, or in this case, oh, some cattle trampled my mink raft, I need a whole new set of equipment. So there is the constant support for volunteers needed. And of course, everybody will be aware there's all the paperwork, the registration, the management of volunteers behind the scene as well. Volunteer retention is always an interesting topic. Volunteers start, they leave, they move on, they do other things. We're constantly recruiting volunteers and encouraging new people to run the project. It is quite a challenge with invasive species, especially plant work, because that's seasonal. So we're quite good at getting people enthused and engaged in the springtime. They work with us through the summer into the autumn, and then we don't have anything for them to do over the winter. Mink volunteers obviously can go all year round, but plant volunteers we do lose quite a lot, and then we sometimes feel we start from scratch at the beginning of the next spring. There are quite a few things we do to encourage our volunteers to stay with us and make sure they're having a good time. Anybody who's worked with volunteers will know coffee break and chocolate biscuits is top of the list, very important. And we always do that with the Kelly kettles. We do a bit of bushcraft, a bit of fire lighting. We break our days up and make sure that they're fun. We include our volunteers when we do staff training. So if we're doing a course on invertebrate study there or tracks and trails, we include our regular volunteers and get them along to that as well. And some of our lucky volunteers we take whitewater rafting, not as a fun day out. We work with Findhorn Rivers Trust, and Findhorn, if you know the site, is a steep-sided river gorge, and the only way to access the hogweed plants, and there are hogweed plants there, this is genuine, is to whitewater raft down the gorge and stop when you see a plant, and we treat those with a stem injector because that's the safest, easiest piece of kit to take on a whitewater rafting trip. We do stay in contact with our volunteers quite a lot, newsletters, emails, and again through social networking is quite important. So you could ask the question, is it worth it? Is all this effort to put into volunteering worth the payback? So in terms of volunteer value, on our mink control project since we started in 2018, we've logged over 50,000 volunteer hours. And on the plant control project, over 15,000 volunteer hours. So it's a big total there, 65,500, which equates to 9,000 odd volunteer days. And if you divide that by number of days in a working year, that starts getting to some big numbers. That's 44 staff years. That's some input, and that would take some matching for employment. So yeah, they can bring value to a project without a doubt, and they can have impact. Callum showed this map this morning. There's no way a single project could manage that scale of mink rafts and mink traps across Scotland like that without the support of volunteers. So, and
left, Vicky.
Yeah, 370 mink dispatched, pretty much. And the same impact on plant control work. We're writing up some site studies now to show the impact that we've had over even just 2 years of control and how that's less and less every year required. But the big question, of course, in is it worth it, is are we creating a long-term sustainable solution through volunteer and community engagement? When our project finishes, is invasive species control work in a sink or swim? We're doing what we can to build capacity. We put our volunteers through PA1, PA6 pesticide qualifications, and over 100 people have gone through that to date. So within the community now are these skilled people that hold their qualifications. And we've enthused and engaged as many people as we can in the project, and will continue to do so over the next couple of years. So just to finish up, a quick snapshot in time. When COVID hit in 2020, when we were back at the end of 2020, we actually found we'd been given this little insight into what would happen if we weren't here. Obviously, engagement and outreach work plateaued, flattened out. Nothing happened other than some webinars and online talks. But in terms of plant control activity, when we locked down in March, we did nothing. Our staff went back out in about June, and we worked one-on-one with volunteers to do hogweed control. We didn't do any Himalayan balsam pulling last year. We didn't do any group activity. We did a little bit of stem injection. So in 2020, although this looks like it's halved, 200 volunteers here, probably about 20 of those went out with our project staff. The other 180 people volunteered off their own back, and they did it without our support. So these are landowners that we trained up in pesticide control, and they carried on treating on their land when estate workers were working. They were community groups who'd done Himalayan balsam pulling with us the previous year, who took it upon themselves to go back out to the site. Now they knew what they were doing and where the site was, and they just carried on regardless. And we saw the same thing with the mink control project. The number of rafts dropped when we hit lockdown. We emailed all our volunteers and we told them to stop all activity instantly. If you remember lockdown last year, it was brutal. It was straight, nothing's happening, that's it, lockdown. And we were really heartened that nearly 200 of our volunteers who were monitoring mink rafts kept going through lockdown. And we heard some lovely messages back. They said to us, "Oh, I decided to use my daily exercise to go and check my mink raft." And we heard stories like, "It gave me a purpose. I felt like I was doing something during lockdown and I was being useful." So we were really quite heartened to hear these stories and to hear that even though we weren't here, we weren't asked them to do anything, some of this work did carry on. And the setup we're looking at of working locally with, the hope is that the fishery trust partners and the rivers trusts will be there in the future and will continue to be that local contact when this project finishes, to enable that little bit of support to continue and to stay there at that community level. And hopefully that might be a solution to long-term invasive species control. So a big thank you to all our volunteers, because I know there's a few of them listening today, for the fantastic work you do. And if anybody wants to volunteer or get involved or find out more, our website address at the top of the page there, or drop us an email or give us a shout on social media. Thank you very much.